Have you ever seen someone the whole village treats like a ghost? A widow, forgotten and alone, suddenly gives up her only bundle of firewood to save a stranger and his sick child lying unconscious in the dirt. No one expected that act of kindness would change not only her life, but the heart of the entire village. The truth is, sometimes the people we cast aside are the only ones brave enough to keep others warm. This short film is based on a true story that won Best Humanitarian Message at the 2023 African Film Festival. If you watch until the end, you'll rediscover faith in human kindness. You'll see how a forgotten woman, a lost man, and a dying child found healing, not through miracles, but through each other. And you'll understand how the smallest gesture can build a bridge that saves a whole community. Abeni, the woman once shamed by all, gave everything she had to help, and that act lit a fire, not just in her home, but in the hearts of everyone around her. If you've lost faith in people, don't scroll past. Sometimes what we need isn't a miracle, just a heart, warm enough to keep hope alive. Under the dim breath of night, she moved like a shadow bent beneath its own weight. Abeni's back curved sharply under the bundle of firewood lashed against her shoulders. Each branch scraped her skin through the thin cloth, and the dry rasp of wood followed her steps like a cruel companion. She crossed the narrow path that cut through the village, her figure barely lit by the fading glow of cooking fires. No one called her name. No hand lifted in greeting. Faces she had known since childhood turned away, as though her body carried a sickness. She was a ghost in her own land, and only the creak of rope on her load marked that she was still alive. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of millet porridge, yet none of it belonged to her. The houses glowed with warmth. She could only pass by. Children's laughter came muffled behind closed doors. She pressed forward with her bundle, step by step, each one driving her deeper into silence. Her breath clouded faintly before her lips. She did not belong to their light. She belonged to the edges, where shadows gathered and memories stung. Then came a sound that froze her mid-stride, a wail, thin and piercing, carried on the wind. It wasn't the cry of a goat or the call of a night bird. It was the raw cry of a child. Abeni turned, the weight of wood grinding against her spine. From the thicket that edged the path, the cry rose again, desperate, broken. Her heart thudded painfully. No one else was near. The villagers had long since barred their doors. She left the path, branches snagging her skirt. The earth was soft, damp from a shower earlier that afternoon. She pushed the firewood against a tree trunk to steady herself, listening. The cry shivered once more, guiding her deeper into the brush. There, beneath the broad leaves of a wild fig, she saw them. A man lay sprawled on the ground, limbs heavy as stone, his face pale beneath the dirt. His lips were tinged blue, breath shallow as a whisper lost. And in the prison of his arms was a child, no more than 2, straining against the crushing embrace, eyes wet with terror. The boy's tiny fists beat weakly against the man's chest, but the arms did not release him. They were stiff, clamped, with the last shred of will. Abeni's breath caught. She knelt, her knees sinking into mud. The man's chest rose faintly. He was not yet gone, though his body looked abandoned by strength. His hand clutched the boy's blanket with a grip so rigid it seemed carved from wood. She reached out, touched his wrist, cold, trembling. His eyelids fluttered but did not open. The boy cried again, high and sharp, a sound that tore through her. She rocked back, hugging herself. The firewood waited at the path, the only thing she had to barter for porridge, for a handful of salt, for survival, another day. Without it, she would starve. Without it, the hunger gnawing at her bones would deepen until it hollowed her to dust. She had carried those branches from the far edge of the forest, her back screaming the whole way. To abandon them was to abandon her own life. Her eyes flicked toward the path. The bundle leaned against the tree like a sentence not yet read. Then back to the pair before her. The man, gray and broken. The child trembling with need. The choice yawned before her like a chasm. For a moment she closed her eyes. She could almost feel the warmth of porridge in her hands, the small relief that kept her alive. Then the boy's cry cracked again, and her body flinched as if struck. Her hands rose to her head, clutching her temples. Then came the sound that sealed it. The wood bundle slid, the ropes groaned, and the mass toppled. It hit the ground with a heavy crash, the sharp snap of breaking sticks shattering the night air. It was like a blade cutting through years of silence, severing her from the small safety she had clung to. She had let go. Her hands trembled as she pried at the man's stiff arms. Slowly, finger by finger, she freed the boy. The child gasped as air rushed back into his lungs. He clung to her neck, tiny body hot with fever and fear. His breath smelled faintly of milk turned sour. His tears soaked her shoulder. She rocked him gently, the smell of sweat and soil clinging to both of them. The man stirred faintly, a groan breaking from his throat. His head lolled but did not rise. His body sagged deeper into the ground, yet even in his collapse his arms twitched, seeking the boy he could no longer hold. Abeni pressed the child against her chest and lifted her eyes to the road. The path stretched long and empty, swallowed by night. Her house lay beyond the bend, a hut more broken than whole. But it was shelter. Her arms ached with the boy's weight. Her back screamed from the long day. Yet she took a step, then another. The bundle of wood lay behind, abandoned, the last tie to her own survival, broken in a single fall. Ahead was only uncertainty, a road that grew darker the farther she looked. She whispered to herself, though no one was there to hear, "If I save them, who will save me?" The night gave no answer. Only the boy's soft sobs filled the silence, and the sound of her footsteps, lonely against the earth. She carried them forward one breath at a time, into a future that had no promise, only wait, and the question she could not silence followed her like a shadow into the dark. The first sound inside the crooked hut was not her own breathing. It was the child's cry, raw and jagged, echoing against the clay walls that once knew only silence. The roof groaned with each gust of wind, the smell of damp straw pressing into the air. But the voice of the boy cut sharper than rain on tin. It was a sound that did not belong to this house of grief, yet now it filled every corner. Abeni pushed the door shut with her hip, clutching the boy tighter. Her arms shook from the weight, not only of him but of what she had abandoned on the roadside. The firewood was gone, her chance at food gone with it. She looked around. The house stood where sorrow had long camped, her husband's bed untouched since the night he was carried out, the corner where she had once laid down prayers until her knees were bruised, the stool that had listened to her silence for years. Now she lowered the stranger's body onto the very bed that had been her husband's. The man's chest lifted faintly, ragged and weak, and then dropped again. The boy twisted in her arms, reaching for the unconscious figure. His hands trembled, reaching as if the man might vanish into the darkness. She knelt and laid him in the old basket woven of cane, the lining frayed to threads but still holding. A thin cloth, stained but soft from years of washing, became his blanket. His cries softened to hiccups, then to whimpers, his tiny fists clutching the edge of the basket as though the world depended on it. The man groaned once, low and broken. His lips moved without words, and Abeni leaned closer. The air smelled of dust and old sweat, but beneath it was a note of something else. Stone, wood, mortar perhaps, the scent of a man who once worked with his hands. His chest rattled like loose pebbles. She tore a strip from her skirt, dipped it in water steeped with leaves from a clay jar, and pressed it against the gash along his shoulder. Blood had clotted there, dark and stubborn. He winced even in his sleep, but she did not stop. Her own hands were rough from carrying burdens. They knew how to bind pain without trembling. Outside, the wind shoved at the shutters. The sky grumbled. The hut seemed smaller than ever, the lantern flame fighting to stay alive. She stirred a pot with the last of her grain, boiling it until it thinned into a watery porridge. She cooled it, lifted a spoon, touched it to the boy's lips. At first he turned away, but when the warm taste hit his tongue, he drank with desperate gulps. The sound of him swallowing filled her chest with an ache that burned hotter than hunger. She fed him slow, patient, until he sighed into sleep. The man shifted again. His eyes cracked open for a moment, clouded and unfocused. His hand groped blindly until it found the splintered edge of the door frame. With surprising instinct, he pushed a broken slat into place, his fingers moving as if memory alone guided them. He wedged it against the frame, crude but steady, before his strength gave out and he collapsed back onto the bed. The gesture lingered in the room like a whisper of who he had once been. She watched the door hold shut against the wind, and in her heart a question flickered. Why would dying hands repair a stranger's house? Night deepened. Shadows bent in the corners. The smell of damp wood seeped from the walls, and the steady drip of rain through the roof marked the passing of time. Abeni sat cross-legged by the low fire, her body weary, her mind circling. The boy stirred in the basket, little breaths rising and falling, and each sound seemed to steady her in ways she did not expect. She looked at the man. His breathing rattled but endured. His face in sleep seemed both hardened and fragile. Who was he to collapse on her path, to bring this storm into her already broken life? She brushed the hair from her brow with trembling fingers. Her body felt emptied, yet her chest was full of a pressure she could not name. In the hush, she did what she had not done in years. She folded her hands, bowed her head to the flame's glow. Her voice barely escaped her lips. It was not a prayer for herself. It was not even a plea for food or firewood or rest. It was for them, the stranger and the child who had tumbled into her night like lost sparks. She whispered to the silence, asking for mercy where none had been offered to her. Her voice cracked, and she pressed her forehead to her knees. The lantern flickered, painting her face in brief flashes of light and shadow. The hut smelled of smoke, herbs, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of the porridge still cooling on the hearth. Her heart clenched with something too fragile to call hope, yet it pulsed there anyway, stubborn and alive. She breathed it in as if it might carry her through another day. The child sighed, rolling in his basket, lips parting with a sound soft as a question. The man on the bed groaned in his half-dream, fingers twitching as though still reaching for what he had lost. And Abeni sat between them, her back straight, though her spirit ached, caught between grief and the strange light rising in her chest. The night held its breath, and so did she. For the first time in years she was not alone, but loneliness had been safer, quieter. Now, with their lives pressed into her walls, she felt the weight of a future that might demand more than she had left to give. The flame sputtered, the shadows swelled, and in the silence after her prayer, she wondered if dawn would bring comfort or sorrow dressed in new skin. The market was alive with noise, but when she stepped into it, silence spread like oil on water. Abeni felt it before she saw it, the weight of stares pressing from every side, the pause in laughter as if her very shadow spoiled the air. A vendor stopped mid-shout. A woman snatched her child closer. Men leaned against their stalls with smirks that cut sharper than blades. The sound returned not as welcome but as venom. Whispers, low and sharp, passing from mouth to ear. She shelters him. A man not her blood. In her house, at night. Shameful. Once a widow, now no better than a harlot. Each word pricked her skin. She walked on, head high, though her chest burned. The basket in her hands rattled with empty gourds. She had come for food, for salt, for grain. She found only eyes. A wet cough broke from a corner, and someone spat on the dirt as she passed. Her palms sweated on the basket handles. She forced her pace to stay even. The stalls overflowed with millet and cassava, smoke curling from roasting maize, but no seller met her eyes. Coins in her palm felt heavier than stones, useless in a place where her name had been buried. Then, instead of turning away, she did what no one expected. She walked back to her house with the same steady pace, the sting of whispers chasing her. When she reached her door, she pushed it wide and stood aside. She let the world see inside, the man pale against the bed, the boy curled in the basket, her own figure bent but unbowed. She left the door open to the wind, to the judgment, to whatever they might dare. The murmurs thickened at the threshold. A crowd gathering at the edge of her yard. Feet shuffled, tongues wagged, but no one crossed the line. Some craned their necks, some sneered, some shook their heads in mock pity. No hand lifted to help, no voice rose to defend. The air pulsed with cowardice, disguised as piety. Abeni's heart pounded so loud she thought it might break through her ribs. Yet she stood still, her body a wall between scorn and the fragile lives behind her. Her silence spoke where words would have failed. If they wanted to condemn, let them do it to her face. None did. They lingered, hungry for spectacle, yet too afraid of what compassion might demand if they stepped closer. The boy stirred and whimpered, a sound so thin it cut through the crowd's mutters. Some turned away, suddenly busy with their wares, ashamed without admitting it. Others lingered with eyes hard as stones. Still, none came forward. One by one they drifted back into the market, leaving only the echo of their disdain. The door remained open. She did not close it. Her chest rose and fell, breath trembling yet unbroken. Inside the house, the man's breath rasped on, stubborn, as though he too resisted death for reasons unknown. The boy pressed a fist to his mouth, sighing into sleep. Outside, the village returned to its rhythm. Yet from where she stood, the air still quivered. The bridge at the far edge of the market groaned in the wind, timbers straining with each gust. The sound floated into the village, a low moan that bent under pressure. No one paid it heed. Children ran across it laughing. Vendors balanced loads as they hurried home. The creak was just another noise among many, but to Abeni it was like the voice of fate, a warning pitched too low for most to hear. She turned back into her house. The open door framed her figure in the glow of the lantern, shoulders straight despite the storm in her chest. She could taste the bitterness left by their whispers, bitter as unripe fruit. But beneath it was another taste, faint but real, the steel of her own defiance. The silence in the room deepened. She sat by the boy, smoothing his tangled hair, her hands steady though her body trembled with exhaustion. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, not with weakness, but with something harder. The house that had once been a tomb of memory now breathed with life, fragile and unwanted by all but her. She listened to the roof creak, the door frame still holding where the stranger's hand had braced it. She thought of the crowd that had watched but not acted, and her heart throbbed with both sorrow and strange pride. She whispered nothing, only let the quiet stretch. For the first time in years, her silence was not only a wound, it was a shield, one that glowed faintly even as the world turned its back. Yet as the night crept in and the last market cries faded, she knew the silence outside was dangerous. Not a silence of peace, but of waiting, of sharpening knives behind closed doors. The weight of it pressed heavy, and though she did not show it, fear coiled cold in her gut. She closed her eyes for a moment. In the distance, the bridge groaned again, louder, and she flinched, though no one else seemed to hear. It was not just wood straining in the wind. It was the sound of something larger, something that might break not only timber, but the fragile line holding her life together. And in that darkened house, with door still open, with her body still trembling but upright, she wondered how long she could stand against the world when the world itself was already cracking. The first word from his cracked lips was not her name. It was a whisper torn out of sleep, hoarse and shaking, the kind of sound a man makes when clinging to a memory too sharp to hold. She didn't make it. The syllables dropped heavy into the silence of the hut, sinking deep like stones into water. Abeni froze where she sat by the low fire. She had been grinding leaves into a paste, the bitter scent of herbs rising to sting her nose. The boy was drowsing in his basket, one small hand curled near his cheek, his breath soft and even. But the man on her bed, the stranger she had dragged back from the dirt, had opened his eyes at last, and grief had spoken before anything else. His gaze drifted, cloudy yet piercing, past the cracked ceiling as if it could open onto another sky. His face was drawn tight, cheekbones jutting sharp, eyes dark hollows. He struggled to lift his head, and Abeni pressed him gently back with a firm hand. "You must rest," she murmured, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. She had spoken so little in recent years that words scraped like gravel in her throat. But he shook his head, stubborn, breath rattling in his chest. His eyes sought the basket, the child within. When they found it, they softened, breaking into raw sorrow. "My wife," he whispered, voice unraveling. "She gave him life, but it took hers. They would not have us. Her family turned their faces away. My own called us cursed. I carried him, searching for a place that would not spit us out." His chest hitched, each sentence clawing its way free. "I tried to keep him warm. I thought, if I could last another day, another mile." His hand trembled toward the boy, but he lacked the strength to reach him. Abeni's heart twisted. She had known loss, had buried it in silence, yet hearing it break raw from his mouth cracked open the sealed places within her. She did not answer. She did not tell him that she too had lost her only anchor in the world, that she too had carried grief alone, until it scalded her from the inside. She simply sat, the heat of the fire on her face, and let his words fall like ash. The boy stirred, as if sensing the weight of memory in the room. His small eyes blinked open, unfocused, then settled on the man's face. His lips parted, and a sound escaped. Not quite a word, more an instinctual call, but it carried the shape of something that struck Abani like thunder. "Mama," he breathed, tiny and unknowing. The syllable hung in the air. Abani's body went rigid. The man closed his eyes in a spasm of pain, perhaps from his wound, perhaps from the echo of a life severed too soon. The child reached his hand outward, not toward the bed, but toward her, fingers grasping the air until she scooped him into her arms. His warmth pressed into her chest, and she rocked, though her mind spun. The word had not been meant, not truly. It had risen from confusion, from need, but it burned through her all the same, searing deeper than she could admit. The man groaned and tried to push himself upright. "The roof," he muttered suddenly, gaze catching the drip, where rain slid through the broken thatch. "If it gives way, the boy will fall sick." Before she could stop him, he staggered to his feet. His legs shook, but some deep instinct moved them. He grabbed a handful of reeds and broken tiles stacked near the wall. With trembling fingers, he climbed onto the low stool, pressing the material into the gaps. Each motion was clumsy, yet deliberate, the mark of a man who had done such work all his life. Sweat streamed down his temples, his body fighting weakness with stubborn will. He wedged the tile, tested it, adjusted until it held. Only then did he sink back, chest heaving, skin glistening with effort. Abani stood speechless. It was a simple act, almost foolish given his condition. But it revealed something. Hands that knew the language of stone and timber, hands that had built more than they had destroyed. Even in near ruin, he fought to mend. She set the child back in the basket and pressed a cloth to the man's brow. "You will tear your wounds open," she warned softly. He gave a faint, crooked smile, a shadow of the man he once must have been. "Better my flesh torn than his breath taken." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time saw not only a burden but a mirror, a soul marked by loss yet refusing to yield. Her chest ached with something dangerous, something that could not yet be named. The night gathered around them. The wind moaned through the village, rattling shutters, hissing against eaves. Shadows thickened in the corners of the hut. Abani knelt by the child, smoothing his hair. She remembered nights when her arms had been empty, when her prayers had been stones falling into a bottomless well. Yet here, in this fragile moment, arms were not empty. Silence was not complete. Her lips moved, but no sound left them. She had no prayer to give shape to the turmoil inside, only a question that trembled like a candle's flame. Why had these two been cast upon her path? Was it chance, or something heavier, a hand unseen weaving grief into unexpected threads? The boy's tiny hand brushed her cheek, warm and damp with sleep. His lips curved faintly as though he dreamed of safety. She inhaled sharply, the scent of porridge still lingering on his breath, the faint smoke of the fire curling around them. The man's breathing steadied, though his body shook with exhaustion. He murmured his wife's name once more, before sleep dragged him under. Abani sat between the sleeping stranger and the dreaming child. Her heart split open, bleeding and burning with a hope she had not asked for. The lantern flickered low, the hut holding them in fragile stillness. Outside, the bridge creaked under the night wind. A groan no one but she seemed to notice. It was a sound of weight and warning, of something waiting to break. She laid her head back against the wall, eyes burning, body trembling from the storm inside, and in the quiet, with the child's accidental word still echoing in her chest, she felt the sharp edge of a new fear. Was she ready to carry the name she had lost, even if it was spoken by lips too young to know its meaning? The cough ripped the night in half. It came dry at first, then ragged and wet, a small body trying to pull air from a storm that refused to share. The roof bowed to the wind, the shutters rapped like knuckles on a door that should never be opened. Lightning washed the hut in cold light, showing the boy's face flushed and slick, his eyelids fluttering, his mouth shaping a thin cry that failed to climb into sound. Abeni was already moving. She slid an arm beneath Nayo's shoulders, lifted him so his chest could rise. Heat poured through his shirt and into her palm. He was a coal in a dying fire, too hot to touch and too precious to drop. She whispered nothing. She angled him upright, pressed his back to her chest, and rocked. The motion helped a little. The cough cut shorter, then came again, deeper. His breath rasped like a frayed rope dragged over stone. Wind hunted every crack. The patched roof held, but only because the stranger had forced old tiles into new obedience. Water threaded along the thatch seams and tapped the floor, a steady metronome counting the seconds between thunder. The smell of rain mixed with the bitter burn of herbs steeping in an earthen pot. Ginger, wild mint. 2 leaves Abeni trusted not because she knew their names in a healer's tongue, but because her mother had once used them on another fever, long before this house lost its laughter. On the bed, Lamaro pushed himself up fast, dizzy, jaw tight, eyes wild. "I'll go," he said, voice raw. "There's a healer across the river. I know the path. The river is not a path tonight." Her voice held. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. She tilted the boy so his throat opened and stroked his spine with the flat of her hand. Slow, certain. The way you speak to a frightened animal without words. "I can run the bank," he insisted, already pulling on a torn shirt, already fighting the sway in his legs. "I can skirt the water and the bridge." She didn't look up. She listened to the sound the child made between coughs, the thin whistle, the way his ribs tried to lift and met a wall. You heard it in the wind. It's aching. One plank loose and the flood will take you. The night will take you. Then who will come back? Lightning stuttered. In the brief white glare, his face was the face of a man who had carried too much and still reached for more. "I can't sit here." Not while his breath cracked. The hut seemed to shrink around the word he could not say. Abeni dipped a cloth into the bowl, wrung it with hands that did not shake, and laid it across the boy's forehead. Steam curled up and kissed her chin. "You can help," she said, "but you will help here." He stared. The water hammered the world. The roof creaked the way the far bridge had creaked in daylight, a warning tucked under ordinary noise. He swallowed. He nodded. "What do you need?" She looked at the hearth. The flames were stubborn, crouched low over damp wood, fed with slivers she had scavenged from broken baskets and a chair leg she could live without. The air tasted of smoke and metal. "Fetch the bowl, the big one, and the clean cloth by the window. Boil water, not rolling, just coax it. Watch the steam. It should rise like breath, not like anger." He obeyed because her voice left no place to disobey. His hands moved quickly, a little clumsy, but when he set the pot on the 3 stones and cupped the wind with his body to guard the flame, she noticed how instinct bent his back, how he made himself a wall. He was used to building shelter. Tonight, He would be the shelter. Nayo's lashes stuck to his cheeks. His pulse beat against Abeni's fingers too fast. She held him upright and hummed low in her throat, a sound she hadn't made since a different life, a sound that once had calmed a husband's bad dreams. The note wasn't a melody. It was a line thrown across water. It was a promise, disguised as breath. "Ginger," she said, and Lamaro added slices to the pot. The scent sharpened, clean and hot. She stirred in dried mint from a little pouch woven of grass. The leaves darkened, surrendering what they held to the simmer. Outside, wind clawed the trees. The bridge at the edge of town gave a long complaint, wood speaking to water in a language older than fear. The thunder rolled closer. On another night, the village would have prayed at its doors. Tonight, it pulled blankets tight and let the storm argue with itself. No one would cross the river for a widow, nobody greeted, and a stranger nobody knew. Abeni dribbled cool water into the crook of the boy's elbows. She ran damp cloths over his wrists and the back of his neck. She did not soak him. She had learned not to bring the body into shock. Gentle, she told herself. Steady. Invite the heat to leave. Do not wrestle it. Invite it. She opened the door to the heat with water and persuaded it to walk away. Lamaro knelt opposite her. He watched with a helplessness that made his jaw work, his hands clench. "He was fine yesterday," he said, as if arguing with a judge. "He laughed at a bird. He reached for my beard and then—" His voice slipped. "He always burns fast. It scares me every time." Abeni lowered the cloth to rinse it again. The steam clouded her fingers. "Sickness likes a door that's already open," she said. "He's thin from the road. The damp came into his lungs. It's not his fault. It's the night's fault. The healer knows a mixture that brings the fever down. He'll give it if The river will take your plea and drink it." She glanced at him then, just a click of her eyes. "If this room empties of calm, he will drown in it. Stay. Make calm with me." He looked at his shaking hands as if they belonged to someone else. Then he wiped them down his thighs and took the cloth when she passed it, and he learned the steady circles she traced across the boy's chest. Slow, firm, so the lungs remembered how to open. Time thinned. It stretched. The storm came in breaths, lightning. Count to 4. Thunder. The seconds between the two grew longer, then shorter again, like a pulse that could not choose a rhythm. The lantern swayed in its wire cradle, painting the walls in waves. The doorframe held because of the piece he had wedged there with his last strength days before. Every gust tested the wood. Every gust met that small, stubborn repair and lost. "He needs air," Abeni said. "Fresh, if we can, but not the night's teeth." She cracked the window's shutter with a sliver of broken reed. Wind slid the edge of itself into the room, cooled the heat clinging to their faces, skimmed the sweat off the boy's forehead. The rain smell came with it, sour and clean, and under that the raw green of torn leaves. Nayo coughed again. It dug at his throat, then failed. His chest rose, stalled, rose again. His eyes opened, dull with fever. For a heartbeat they found Abeni's face. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He only looked, and in the look something unclenched inside her, because the world had not made him forget her in one night. The broth was ready. She cupped a little in a wooden spoon, let it cool with a breath, tested it on her wrist. Warm, not hot. She touched it to the boy's lips. He turned away. She waited. She talked with her eyes. He tried. The liquid made a soft sound when it touched his tongue. He swallowed. He coughed. He tried again. The second swallow stayed. "Good," Lamaro whispered. He pressed his hands to his knees so he wouldn't reach out and shake the child from terror into calm. That's good. That's my brave boy. A gust leaned on the hut. The bridge complained again. The sound came a beat later, deeper, like ribs creaking. Abeni's spine tightened. She had lived long enough to learn what wood says before it splits. She listened, counting. The river bellowed. Somewhere, a pot crashed. A dog barked and went quiet. She went back to work. She made the room a rhythm. Spoon, swallow, cloth, breath, rub, pause. She took the panic out of the air and put purpose there instead. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She spoke to the fever as if it were a guest that had overstayed and could be ushered from the door with dignity. Lamaro watched that, and the fear that had been the only thing holding him up started to turn into something else. He had survived by running. He had survived by mending what broke. Tonight, nothing he could hammer would hold the river. But he could learn a new trade whose tools were patience and heat and touch. He steadied the lantern when the wind wanted it. He tended the coals so the pot never died. He made his shoulders broad so the boy saw something steadfast when he opened his eyes. "You're not afraid," he said, amazed. Not as praise, but as a discovery he had needed all night. Abeni's mouth twitched. "I am afraid," she said. "I just don't let it carry the water." He absorbed that. Thunder moved off, then swung back, mischief in a giant's grin. The hours walked on their knees. The fever climbed, stepped down, climbed again. Once, the boy slumped so heavily she thought he'd slipped under sleep too deep. But his lashes fluttered and he found the spoon. Once, the wind pressed a hard hand on the shutter and the reed wedge cracked, and Lamaro braced the window with his body until the gust spent itself, shouting. "You should rest," he said, because the thought of her falling frightened him more than the storm. He didn't say why. "If I lie down, I will listen too closely to my own head," she said. "It is loud there in the dark." The words surprised them both. She never offered her inside to anyone. But the night had peeled things away. It had left plain boards. "Then talk," he said. "Talk where I can hear." She smiled once, thin and tired. "I had a child once," she said, and the wind missed a step, and he looked at her with a new kind of quiet. But the world took the name before he took a breath. The house learned to hold only two, silence and me. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say anything at all. He reached across the boy's small body and set his hand on the floor near hers, so their fingers almost touched. Heat radiated from the pot. The floor was wet where the rain had been. His hand was scarred where a stone had failed to obey. They were both builders of different ruins. The night deepened toward something like morning. The thunder moved farther out over the river. The bridge groaned, and then went quiet for a long time, as if collecting itself. The rain became threads instead of ropes. The air cooled. Somewhere a rooster tried its voice and lost to the wind. Abeni lifted the boy and pressed him against her shoulder again, the better to hear. His breath rattled, then smoothed, then rattled. She pictured the lungs as doors she could open with her hands. She stroked his back. She counted. She did not cry. "Tell me his name," she said. "Nayo," Lamaro answered. "It means we are with you even when we are tired." She closed her eyes. The meaning settled on the room like a blanket Agnes might have woven in another life. All tight knots and patience. "Then stay with me, Nayo," she murmured, not to claim, but to invite. "Stay in your body. Stay in this breath. Stay long enough to hear the birds laugh at the storm." The boy's skin burned her cheek. Her arms ached. Her back screamed. Her head swam with hunger and smoke. Still she rocked. Still she hummed the non-song. Still she kept the room's rhythm from breaking. Lamaro refilled the bowl. His hands were steadier. He had learned the heat's language. He slipped a stick under the pot to lift it out of the impatience that makes water boil too hard. He watched the steam rise like a thin white ribbon, and he nodded to it as if it were a worker he was paying by the hour. "Thank you," he said to the air, or to her, or to a roof he had no right to trust and yet did. A sharp gust slid under the door and licked the flame and set the lantern to guttering. The hinge he had wedged moaned, then caught. The door tried and failed to open. The little repair held like a promise someone had thought too small to matter. He saw it then, the way even a scrap of wood in the right place could turn a storm aside. He looked at Abeni, with the knowledge softening something in his face. Tonight, she was that wedge. Not loud, not big, essential. The fever peaked. It made his eyes glassy and wide, his hands fumble at the air for a shape that wasn't there. Abeni's breath shortened to match his, as if her lungs could lend him their plan. She put a drop of honey on his tongue to tempt him toward swallowing. She wiped his neck. She never stopped speaking with the weight of her hands. They worked until the lamp oil thinned and the wick bent. They worked until the thunder became memory and the rain chose distant roofs. The sky beyond the cracks thinned to a bruised gray. Morning was somewhere on the other side of the dark. Nayo coughed once more, a hard cough that clawed and then retreated. He rested. He tried to draw air and met a high wall he couldn't climb. The sound that came was a small wheeze, the kind that makes grown people forget how to stand. The bowl trembled in Abeni's hands. She steadied it against her knee. She leaned close so her cheek was almost on his forehead. She heard the whistle. She heard the pause after it. Too long. She counted again. 1, 2, 3. The pause stretched. Lamaro's breath broke. "Please," he said, "tonight or to water, or to the woman who had told him to sit tight in a room where terror could not be fed. Please, please." Abeni pressed the warm cloth to the boy's chest and lifted him higher, the better for what little light there was to find his face. "Stay," she whispered into his hair. The word was smoke. It was iron. It was everything she had ever lost asked for in one syllable. His chest stuttered. The pause went on. Her arm shook so hard the spoon chimed against the bowl. Outside, the bridge gave a sound like a sigh cut off, a deep final note that might have been wood settling or wood surrendering. The wind fell still, as if listening. The room held its breath with her. And in that last breath of night, when the world was balanced on a thin edge between storm and morning, she felt time split, a path where the dawn would find them all, and a path where it would not. She pressed the cloth. She rocked. She willed the smaller path to widen. Then the pause deepened, and the question, terrible and simple, rose in the dimness and hung over the three of them like the edge of the sky. Would morning reach them in time, or would the night keep what it had already claimed? Dawn broke not with silence, but with a gasp. Nayo's breath, shallow and ragged through the storm's long night, finally softened into something gentler. His little chest, once rising in frantic jerks, now moved in an even rhythm. His lashes quivered, then settled. His heat ebbed just enough for the sheen of sweat to cool on his brow. In the dim light of morning, he looked less like a flame burning itself out and more like a boy cradled by rest. Abeni's eyes, raw from keeping vigil, fixed on him. Her hand shook as she touched the cloth to his skin one more time, expecting fire. Instead, warmth, human, not fever. She closed her eyes, breath breaking into a sound too fragile to be called laughter, too fierce to be tears. Lamaro fell against the bed frame, his face buried in his arm, shoulders trembling with relief. They did not speak. The room itself seemed to exhale with them. The lantern, nearly spent, guttered once before dying. Light from the slit in the shutters replaced it, thin gold brushing the boy's cheeks. For the first time in days, the house carried a sound different from pain. The sound of sleep, without struggle. Abeni pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, body slack with exhaustion. But her gaze stayed on Nayo. A mother's instinct had not asked her permission to return. It had simply come, demanding her hands, her prayers, her strength. Now it sat inside her like a secret ember. The storm outside had passed, but its mark lay everywhere. The ground was slick, the air heavy with the scent of mud and riverweed. From the open window drifted a new sound, faint at first, but growing. A low crack, then a sharp splinter, then silence. She stiffened. She knew that sound. Lamaro lifted his head, hearing it too. They both turned toward the east, where the path led to the river. Then came another crack, loud and final, followed by the roar of water rushing where it should not. Birds burst from trees, wings frantic. "The bridge," Lamaro whispered, voice hollow. He stood as if drawn by something bigger than choice, his hand gripping the window frame. "It's gone." Abeni's breath caught. That groaning wood, the sound she alone had truly listened to, while the market turned its eyes from her. It had been a warning, and now it had spoken its last. By mid-morning, the village gathered on the riverbank. The scene was chaos painted against sunlight that felt cruel in its brightness. Where once the bridge had spanned with crooked pride, nothing remained but jagged posts jutting from the torrent. Pieces of timber spun in the current, slammed against rocks, vanished downstream. The river, swollen from the storm, roared with triumph, carrying away the last connection between the village and the world beyond. Children cried at their mothers' skirts. Men shouted over one another, voices sharp with fear. "The market," one called. "The healer, the school," cried another. "We are cut off." Panic thickened like smoke, each voice feeding the next. Abeni stood at the edge with Lamaro beside her, Nayo in her arms. The boy slept on, unaware of the loss that had just struck not only his new shelter, but every soul around them. Villagers shot glances at her, the same glances they had cast in the market, accusing, contemptuous. But now their eyes darted to Lamaro too, a stranger whose shadow had crossed their widow's doorway, a man who had arrived with the storm. Bad luck, someone muttered. First him, now the bridge. She felt the sting of their words, but she kept her eyes on the river. Her arms tightened around the boy. Lamaro's jaw worked as he listened, but he didn't answer them. Instead, his gaze followed the sweep of the current, measuring, calculating, the way a craftsman weighs a broken wall before lifting the first stone. The village elder, bent with age yet voice clear, raised a hand. "The bridge must be rebuilt," he said, though his tone trembled. "Without it, we are trapped." "But who will build it?" came the bitter reply. "Our men farm, they hunt, they trade. None know the bones of wood and stone." Murmurs rippled. Faces turned away. No one offered their hands. The fear of the river was older than any of them. To step into it was to risk being swallowed whole. Abeni felt a strange, quiet bloom in her chest. The night's ordeal still hung heavy, but something in her whispered that this was no accident. The fever had spared Nayo at dawn, only for the bridge to fall by midday. Both miracles and losses struck without warning. Perhaps they were not separate things at all. Lamaro stepped forward, slow but steady. His voice, when it came, was rough but certain. "I will build it." The word startled even him. Yet once spoken, they belonged to the air, and the villagers turned as one. He met their stares, not lowering his eyes. "I have built walls that held back storms. I have set stones that still stand. Give me rope, timber, hands to help, and I will raise it again." A hush followed. The same people who had whispered against Abeni now measured this man. Some looked doubtful, some scornful, but beneath it ran a current of desperate hope. A child clutched his mother's skirt, asking if they could go to school again. A woman's eyes flicked toward the healer's hut across the river, lips pressed thin. The elder gave a long sigh. "Then you will lead us." The day wore on with arguments, gathering materials, tracing plans in the dirt. Abeni watched from the edge, rocking Nayo, her heart torn between awe and dread. The villagers who had scorned her door now clustered around Lamaro, listening, repeating his words as if they were lifelines. But as the sun dipped lower, she caught a sound under the noise of hammers and rope, the faint wheeze of Nayo stirring in her arms. He coughed once, then nestled deeper into her shawl. Relief flooded her, but fear followed quick. If the boy's fever returned, there was no bridge to reach the healer. Their survival was tied to the strength of a man barely healed himself. Evening fell. Smoke rose from cook fires, mingling with sawdust and sweat. Abeni laid Nayo down in his basket near the worksite, unwilling to leave his side. She watched Lamaro's hands command the building as if he were summoning memory itself. Where others faltered, he steadied. Where fear crept, he spoke with the authority of someone who had learned to trust timber's language. Yet when the villagers' eyes lit with gratitude, Abeni's chest tightened. Gratitude was fickle. Today they leaned on him. Tomorrow they might turn. She had lived long enough to know how swiftly admiration became suspicion. Night deepened. The half-built frame of the bridge rose against the stars, a skeleton daring the river to strike again. Abeni sat by the boy, who slept under the glow of firelight, his breath smooth but fragile. She looked at the water below, black and restless, and a shiver ran through her. The bridge had fallen, but something else had risen in its place. Not just wood and rope, a thread binding her fate, the stranger's fate, and the boy's fate to a village that had once turned its back. She pressed her hand against her chest, where the ember of hope still glowed, and asked herself a question she did not dare speak aloud. When the bridge stood again, would it carry them toward belonging, or toward another fall? The river roared, and the night gave no answer. They met the river with bare hands and raised voices. Morning light struck the current until it glittered like broken glass, and the villagers lined the bank as if numbers could stitch the world back together. Wood posts stuck up like ribs from a chest that would not rise. Ropes hung from the far side, frayed and defeated. The water still carried fragments of the bridge, spinning them end over end, then swallowing them whole. The air tasted of mud and iron. Someone called a name. Someone else cursed the sky. Children stared through their mothers' skirts and tried not to cry. Abeni stood at the edge, shawl pulled tight, Nayo warm and drowsy against her back. His breath brushed her neck, steady at last. It steadied her. She kept her gaze on the water, not on the faces that cut sideways at her like small knives. Their eyes slid to the man at her side and sharpened further. A stranger, a burden, a storm that had washed up on the widow's doorstep and been invited in. The elder lifted his staff and tamped it once into the mud. The thump felt like a heartbeat. "Our road is gone," he said. "The market is cut. The healer is a river away. The school has no path." His voice trembled, not from age, but from the naked edge of need. Murmurs swelled. "We can't all swim." The current would break a bull. Who knows how to set a span? Answers scattered like frightened birds. No one stepped forward. Men shifted their weight and studied their boots. Women clutched their baskets harder. The river kept speaking in its one tongue. "Come closer and I will take you." A low creak carried on the wind, the memory of wood under strain. So faint Abini thought only she heard it. The same sound that had haunted the market's afternoons and her nights by the open door. Warning had always sounded like that, present yet invisible, a voice the village pretended was wind. Beside her, Lamaro's jaw set. He had been quiet all morning, measuring with his eyes. He looked at the carved mud of the bank, at the far abutment still rooted like a stubborn tooth, at the way the water leaned, and then eased as it curled around the broken posts. He looked the way a mason reads stone, listening with the body more than with the ears. "I will raise it," he said, and the river did not drown him out. His voice cut clean and stood. "I am a builder. Give me rope, sound timber, and hands that can learn, and we will cross again." Heads turned. It was not only surprise that greeted him, distrust, too, wearing the old mask of righteousness. A Jua, whose tongue could slice fruit without a knife, let out a scoff sharp enough to draw blood. "A man who arrives with ruin promises salvation," she said. "How convenient." He didn't flinch. Wood fails when water eats at what holds it together, not because wood is evil, because no one listened when it spoke. He pointed, not with swagger, but with a carpenter's exactness. "The far footing will serve. The near is rotted where soil gave way. We'll dig to stone and seat a new base. We'll set two posts together and bind them so they share the load. Rope will carry what wood cannot. Triangles, not squares. Squares fold. Triangles," one of the men said, half a laugh, half a challenge. 3 points do not argue," Lamaro answered. He crouched and pressed his palm into the wet mud. "They hold each other up." The elder studied him a long breath, then another. Wind lifted the fringe of his shawl. "And if the river does not allow, then we learn the river's temper and speak so it hears us." Lamaro looked up and the morning struck his eyes until they went the color of wet bark. "I do not say it will be quick. I say it will be done." A silence fell that was not quite trust. Not yet. But underneath it, desperation pushed, and desperation is a good teacher. The elder nodded once. Men who had mocked Abeni the day before found themselves stepping toward rope. Boys ran for tools. Girls brought gourds of water. Even Ajua gathered her skirts up from the mud, pursed her mouth, and said nothing more. Lamaro began where fear lived. He had them wade knee-deep and feel, not the surface, not the spray, but the pool underneath where the current tried to slip their feet from the earth. He taught them to lean, to make their bodies long ropes, to give the river a shape it could not move. He spoke to them as he'd spoken to timber in 100 storms, calm, firm, exact. He placed stones beneath the water by touch alone, testing each with his weight, reading their answers. He drove long stakes into the bank in pairs so one steadied the other. He asked for wedges, small pieces of wood that would seem to matter to no one, and he slid them where the stakes shivered until the trembling stilled. A small thing in its right place is a wall. The day thickened with work. Hammers found rhythm. Rope hissed across rough wood. Men sweated and stopped laughing. The river took what fell and kept it, but it also gave back information if you were humble enough to listen. When a line slipped, Lamaro read the angle and changed it. When a plank bucked, he moved the fulcrum a handspan and it obeyed. He called the joints by names that sounded like family, tongue and groove, shoulder and seat, not to show off but to remind the men that wood, like kin, holds when it knows where it belongs. Abeni moved through the heat like a quiet current. Nayo now awake and tied to her back. She fetched rope. She steadied a ladder. She pressed a cup into a shaking hand and did not mind when that hand forgot to thank her. She was too busy listening to something else, the change in the air between scorn and need. Their eyes still slid across her like rain over a roof, but now and then one landed and stayed. It was not apology. It was not yet respect. It was a pause where contempt used to be. Lamaro climbed the half-built frame and stood above the river. His body remembered what it had been made for. He moved without bravado, patient as winter. When a young man shifted his weight wrong and the plank under him pitched, Lamaro's hand shot out fast, quicker than fear. He hauled the boy up by the collar and set him back on a safer timber. He did not scold. He showed where the foot must go. He made the boy try again and nodded when the plank stayed quiet. The nod was a gift, weighed and real. The boy straightened, taller by an inch no one could see. By noon, a skeleton reached toward the far bank. The river hissed under it like something denied. Clouds piled on the horizon and cast shade that felt like mercy. Women laid down bowls of cassava and roasted fish, and men ate standing, mouths full, eyes still on their lines as if the bridge would walk away, if not watched. Work changed them. It always did. It moved talk from gossip to measurement. It replaced rumor with angles. It taught humility no sermon could. The elder came close to Abeni and watched her watch. He did not speak of the market day, of open doors and closed hearts. He only said, "He knows what trees say. He listens," she said simply. She kept her eyes on Lamaro's hands because watching them steadied something inside her that had wobbled for years. Afternoon slid toward evening with a long sigh. The frame had weight now. It hummed when wind touched it instead of rattling. Ropes crisscrossed like woven reed. Lamaro sent 2 men over the water with a guideline and their bodies for ballast. The whole village held its breath until they reached the far post and looped the rope around it twice, 3 times, 4. When they pulled, the rope sang, and the sound was not fear. It was promise stretched tight. Then the river changed its mind the way all living things do. It surged, sudden and hard, as if remembering the storm's power and wanting one last dance. A log, heavy as a bull, came charging down the brown water, snout up, teeth bared in the red of a broken root. Shouts jumped from bank to bank. The log struck a post with a crack that shook mud loose from the far slope. The frame shivered. A woman screamed a name that was not her own. Lamaro dropped from the beam with the clean surrender of a stone choosing its path. He hit the shallows, went under, came up with his head where the log would be. He didn't fight it. He met its shoulder with his own, turned it just enough, guided it not into the heart of the frame, but toward a place where rock waited to harmlessly bruise it. The water bullied. He leaned. He moved with it the way he had told the men to move, long, not stiff. The log passed, disgruntled, and went on to break something else in a place where no one was trying to stand. He came back to the bank shivering, his breath tearing and then mending as it found its pace. He spit mud and grinned, a quick, boyish slash. "It does not get to choose," he said. "We choose." In that moment, the men believed with their bodies what they had only agreed to with their mouths. Hands tightened on rope. Work rose into song, the kind that isn't music but has melody anyway. Even Ajua clamped her lips around her judgment and thrust a wedge into Lamaro's wet hand without comment. He took it, slid it under a trembling brace, and the trembling stopped. By dusk, boards lay across the frame like ribs, laid across a chest. Not many. Enough to tempt the idea of crossing, enough to make the elders' eyes wet. They could have stopped. They did not. They worked until the first star blinked and another answered. Torches sprouted along the bank. Their light flickered in the water, a chain of fire reflected in the river's restless back. At last, Lamaro raised a hand. Not a flourish, a quiet. The village hushed with him, breath pooled in one shared place. He stepped onto the first plank. It took him. He tested the second with his weight and the third with his patience. The bridge spoke in creaks he understood, and in silences the crowd could hear. Halfway out, he paused and stamped once. The sound that came back was not a complaint. It was the low, solid answer of something seated where it belongs. He crossed. At the far bank, he turned and raised his right arm, and a roar went up that was too big to belong to one throat. Men clapped each other's backs. Women laughed and cried into their shawls. Children jumped so hard the torches trembled. Nayo, on Abani's back, woke and made a sleepy sound like a small drum afraid to be loud. She pressed her hand to his foot and breathed as if someone had been holding her underwater and had just let go. They did not rush the crossing. He would not allow it. He brought people over a handful at a time, a family, then a trader, then two of the boys who had tied the first line. Every step was a lesson in respect. Every footfall taught the village to hear the span's music, the living sound of wood under honest weight. When the elder crossed, staff ticking on planks, the crowd hushed and then released another cheer that curled up into the dark like smoke, with a blessing inside it. On the far bank, a place was cleared. Someone found a ribbon of dyed cloth and tied it between two stakes, because that is what people do when they need ceremony to tell their bodies, "This moment will hold." The elder lifted his palm for quiet, and quiet came as if pulled on a string. "We called for help," he said. "We expected none. We received more than we deserved." He turned to Lamaro and set the staff gently to his shoulder. "You did not bring a price. You brought your hands. A village should not be empty of its thanks. We ask you to stay. Take a place here. Take work here. Take kin here." He looked past the builder to the woman standing with a child under the torch's thin light. His eyes had learned something since the market's day. Make a home that storm cannot shake. The crowd bent toward the answer the way grass leans when a wind decides. Lamaro's throat moved. He had mud in the lines of his palms, river in his hair, and a rope burn like a thin red bracelet around his wrist. He could have spoken of wages. He could have spoken of shelter, of security, of what he would need in exchange for saving them from their own limits. He did not. He lifted his hand and pointed across the water. Past the new span, the crooked roof of a small house tilted like a question against the sky. Its doorframe still held because a man who should by all rights have been dying had pressed a scrap of wood into the right place and asked it to be strong. Light bled out of that doorway now in a small square. It looked like a promise that didn't know it was one. "I have been where I belong," he said, and the words did not swell, they sank. They found the deepest place in every chest and settled there. He did not say her name. He did not need to. Every eye that could see followed his finger and found the hut. Every heart that could feel followed the line between that hand and that doorway, and recognized the shape of a choice. No one moved. Even the river seemed to take a breath. The torches hissed and quieted. The night insects held their tiny machines still. Abeni could not swallow. Her body felt like a door someone had propped open before she was ready. Heat climbed her face and did not leave. She kept her head straight and her spine long because if she bent at all, she would break. Ajua's fingers twitched where they held the edge of her scarf. The woman's mouth opened and shut, as if choosing which blade to draw and finding none suited. Around her, wives who had turned gossip into sport felt the sport go flat. Men who had grunted disapproval at her open door found their throats full of something too human to spit out. Children stared, wide-eyed at the grown world learning a new shape. The elder lowered his staff and bowed his head, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of something too clear to argue with. "Then may your place be blessed," he said. "May the work you have done today be the beginning and not the end." Lamaro crossed back first, not because he had built the bridge, but because the moment required it. Each plank lifted and set his weight with the grace of wood that trusts its work. At the near bank, he paused, turned his palm up to Abeni, as if offering to carry the invisible weight that had made her back a bow for years. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The gesture made the air brighter. Nayo, awake now, reached a hand past her shoulder. His fingers brushed Lamaro's wrist and held, simple as breath. A sound climbed out of him that might have been a word, and might have been a memory finding a body, small and brave. The river made a low noise that was almost kind. They walked toward the crooked house with the new span stretching behind them like a sentence that had taken too long to be said. The crowd parted, not out of fear now, not out of scorn, but because something was being carried that should not be jostled. People pressed their palms to their chests without meaning to. Torches leaned. The night curled close to listen. At the door, Abeni stood on the threshold she had once flung wide to shame, and found it change beneath her feet. The frame did not groan. The wedge held. Inside, the room smelled of ash and ginger, and the salt of dried tears. The little basket waited with its frayed lining. The fire stirred the air with the soft sound of a sleeping thing. Behind her, the village held their breath, as one body, all their old stories stacked in their throats. The man who had rebuilt their way to the world had chosen a house the world had refused. The woman they had called unclean had become the place where a stranger and a child had lived when the night was not generous. The river was bridged, but the gap between judgment and mercy hung open, asking to be crossed. Abeni's hand tightened on the door. Heat climbed her face again, then dropped to settle behind her ribs. She looked back once over her shoulder. 100 eyes wavered in the torchlight, some already softening, some still hard, all waiting. She stepped inside. The boy's small hand patted her collarbone, as if to tell her she had done enough for today. Lamaro paused on the threshold and looked at the wedge he had set days ago, then at the roof he had pressed closed with shaking fingers, then at the low bed where his breath had struggled, and then evened. He smiled with something that hurt and healed at the same time. He followed her in. The door remained open, as it had on the market's cruel afternoon. but the air on the threshold was different. The night peered in, curious rather than hungry. Outside, the new bridge hummed under the feet of the last few crossing home. The torches spat and lowered. The elder's staff clicked once against a stone, then was still, and there, in the hush between the day's roar and the dark's long quiet, the question rose and held them all by the throat. Now that he had spoken and she had not turned away, would the village step across the span that mattered more than the one over the water? Or would they leave this house lit and alone, a small island braced against another storm? Flames licked the dark like tongues of memory. The crooked hut that had once swallowed Abini's sobs now pulsed with light, each crack in the wall glowing with the rise of fire. The scent of smoke mixed with millet porridge. The pot simmered, its lid clattering against the boil, while shadows of 3 bodies bent and lifted across the clay floor. The storm was gone, the bridge stood again, and yet the room carried a weight greater than wood or water. It was the weight of eyes outside. Nayo giggled, a soft, wet sound, chasing the steam with his tiny hands. His laughter filled the hut with something it had never carried, a child's noise that wasn't grief. Lamaro leaned forward, feeding a log into the hearth. His hands, still raw with rope burns, moved gentle as though placing a jewel. Sparks snapped, climbing toward the roof beams. Abani sat close, her shawl slipped from her shoulders, the fire catching the sheen of her skin. For the first time, warmth belonged to them, not begged, not stolen, belonged. Then came the sound of footsteps, a shuffle, hesitant, dragging against the dirt outside. Abeni's heart stumbled. The door was open as always, her choice to face the world without walls. The shadows deepened, and into that square of firelight stepped figures she never thought she would see crossing her threshold. Adjua stood first, shoulders sharp, scarf knotted tight beneath her chin. The same tongue that had once spat venom now fumbled for words. She carried nothing in her hands at first. Then, awkwardly, she set down an offering at the hearth, a loaf of bread, crust still warm from her oven. Her eyes did not rise to meet Abeni's. Her lips moved around a whisper, shaped like surrender. I was wrong. The hut held its breath. Lamaro froze, log still in his palm. Nayo squealed, reaching for the loaf as though sensing no history behind it. Abeni's throat tightened. She looked at the bread, its golden skin cracking open in the heat, releasing the tang of yeast and smoke. That smell had once belonged to everyone else's tables, but never hers. Now it lay at her fire, softening into acceptance. More came. Men who had muttered curses in the market now set gourds of palm wine against her wall. Women who had dragged their children away from her shadow now laid dried fish by the pot. Even the elder ducked under the low door frame, leaning heavy on his staff, and rested a bundle of kindling against the hearth, as though admitting her flame had become theirs. Abeni's hand shook as she reached for the bread. It was not hunger that made her tremble. It was the sight of walls she thought eternal cracking at last. She had lived long enough to know apologies rarely came with words. They came with offerings, with acts, with silence reshaped into presence. Lamaro broke the loaf, handed a piece first to the boy. Nayo gnawed it with clumsy delight, crumbs sticking to his lips. Then Lamaro handed a piece to Abeni. She hesitated, her fingers brushing his as she took it. Her eyes caught the glow of the fire, wet and sharp, before she raised the bread to her mouth. It tasted of surrender, of grudging respect, of something she dared not yet call peace. The villagers sat awkwardly, some on stools, some on the floor. They did not chatter as they might at their own hearths. They watched. They breathed together. They let the fire tell the story that words failed to shape. And then, when the silence had nearly settled into comfort, the elder spoke. His voice was rough stone turned in the hand. "We came here thinking your house was a ghost's den. Tonight we see it is a place where the living endure. We see what it held when we looked away." He touched his staff to the ground, the sound small but final. "We will not look away again." The air thickened, not with smoke, but with something heavier. Abeni bowed her head, hiding her face in the glow. She thought of the nights she had knelt alone, begging for even one voice to speak in her favor, and found only silence. Now voices sat in her house, not praising but present. That alone was more than she had ever thought to carry. Lamaro's eyes moved over the faces gathered, then back to Abeni's. He said nothing. His silence was a shield, allowing her the choice to speak or to hold still. She kept still. Her heart was too full of breaking and mending all at once. The night deepened. The fire roared higher, fueled by the elder's kindling, by the wood Lamaro split, by the courage Abeni had carried for too many years alone. Shadows danced across the walls, no longer menacing but alive, shaping patterns of people leaning toward each other, patterns that spoke of belonging. Later, when the villagers drifted back to their homes, when the offerings lay scattered around the hearth like proof, Abeni reached for another log. She laid it on the fire, watching the sparks leap. The wood crackled, releasing its heart into heat. The flames swelled until their light touched every corner of the house. She thought of the bundle she had dropped on the path that night, the one sacrifice that had opened a door to all of this. Wood she had abandoned then had returned to her now, multiplied, shared. Nayo stirred, eyes heavy with sleep, his small hand pawing at her wrist. She lifted him close. His hair smelled of smoke and porridge. His skin carried the warmth of fire and the softness of safety. He pressed his face against her neck and sighed. The sound pierced her deeper than judgment ever had. Lamaro leaned against the door frame, his shoulders outlined in firelight. He watched her with a gaze steady as the beams he had set into the riverbank. His hands, scarred and raw, dangled open at his sides. He did not need to speak. The bridge behind him had already spoken for him. Outside the night was still. No storm, no whispers. Only the hush of a village learning to breathe together again. The bridge stood behind them like a spine rebuilt, a new bone binding what had been broken. Abeni placed the log deeper into the hearth. The fire roared, bright and defiant. Its glow filled the hut, spilling through the open door, spilling into the street, spilling into the eyes of anyone still watching. It was no longer the fire of one widow's survival. It was the fire of a home, and as the flames rose higher, she understood. The ghosts had left. The house no longer carried only memory. It carried witness, forgiveness, and the beginning of something too fragile to name but too strong to deny. She pressed her cheek to Nayo's hair. Her lips moved around a whisper no one else could hear. A vow, quiet but carved deep. The fire cracked, sparks rushing upward, carrying her words into the night. And in that hush, as the embers lit the faces of those who had once turned away, a question trembled unspoken. If fire could warm a village, could it also change its heart forever? Or would the flames one day fade, leaving her again with only ash? When storms pass and silence settles, What remains is not the sound of thunder, but the quiet proof that people endured together. Life is not measured by the weight of sorrow we carry alone, but by the hands that reach for one another in the dark, even when they have nothing left to give. In every broken span, there lies the chance to rebuild, not stronger because wood or stone are flawless, but because human hearts decide to stand side by side and share the burden. There will always be whispers, doubts, and nights that feel endless. Yet in those nights, a small ember can outlast the storm. A single act of courage, a single refusal to look away, can kindle warmth enough for an entire village. What once was scorn can become the very light others gather around. And what once seemed a ruin may become the foundation of a future shaped not by fear but by compassion. This story is not about victory shouted in triumph, but about endurance spoken in whispers. It reminds us that dignity is not granted by others, but chosen by the way we keep walking forward, even when our arms are heavy and our voices shake. The bridges we build are not only of wood and rope, but of mercy, forgiveness, and the fierce will to believe that even broken lives can belong again. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson. Every home, no matter how weathered, can hold light if we dare to open the door. Every life, no matter how scarred, can rise again when touched by understanding. We are not made whole because the world is gentle. We are made whole because, despite its cruelty, we choose to keep the fire alive. Thank you for listening and walking through this journey. If these words touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, to let your voice be part of the circle. And if you wish to continue traveling with us through more stories of resilience and humanity, please follow and subscribe. Your presence gives these stories a place to belong.